Arthur Herman is an author that is probably known to many of you, an author of 9 books ranging across all kinds of subjects. He and I first connected and bonded over How the Scots Invented the Modern World, his bestseller, which is being translated into Ukrainian as we speak, I understand. And I did my doctoral dissertation on David Hume and the Scottish Enlightenment, so we connected that way. But if you like Vikings, he's got a book on the Vikings. If you like Gandhi and Churchill, he's got a book on that. General MacArthur. Freedom's Forge is a very popular book here. Oh, Adam's got his copy. Several of us were with a group of people the past 2 days, investors and entrepreneurs who are doing a lot at the intersection of deep technology, military technology, manufacturing. And it turns out that it's a huge fan club of Arthur Herman's, we found out at this session. So you'll definitely want to pick up a copy of that book if you haven't read it. So I'm going to invite Arthur to come up here. If you do need to step out, please do and come back. And I will let him close us out today with reflections that he has on the history and future of dynamism in America. So Arthur, welcome.
Thanks. I am going to take my ease, sit on a chair. We're going to keep this as informal as possible. I don't have a PowerPoint for you or a film or anything along those lines here. And I'm very much aware that as I speak that the reception calls. So we want to sort of move through the discussion here. When Ryan asked me if I wanted to be involved with this, and I said absolutely. It'll be a great pleasure to be part of this distinguished group of speakers and themes that are hugely important, especially now when we're all looking for ways in which to rediscover and revivify American economy, American society, Western society. These are themes that I think are both very urgent in many ways, but are also ones that I think need to be expanded and understood more broadly. So with that in mind, Ryan then asked me, he said, well, what do you want to call the title of your talk? And I said, well, how about the cultural foundations of American dynamism? And what I'm going to be talking about will be built around 2 of my books as a way to explore those foundations. One that deals with more recent history, and that's the one that Adam very thoughtfully and generously flashed, Freedom's Forge. The other one, going back a little bit more in history to the 18th century, which is the other book that Ryan mentioned, How the Scots Invented the Modern World. And what I want you to think about this is my remarks here as not contradicting, but rather building upon the commentary that you've already heard on the essential characteristics of dynamism, the do's and the don'ts that go with that phenomenon, with that issue. But also, too, perhaps not just building upon, but digging underneath, looking into the cultural archaeology that supports these phenomena, and in particularly the outbreaks that have happened again in very recent history, and then I would argue even within the course of American history. They also mentioned something else, which I think would be a really good starting point for us, which is the conference that we've been participating in here in Austin the last couple of days, a conference called Endless Frontiers. Virginia was there. Ryan was there. Adam was there, which was looking into the question of how to revivify and rebuild a sense of industrial productivity, of industrial innovation, with a particular focus on one area where this has become supremely lacking in ways that actually threaten national security, which is our defense industrial base. Our defense industrial base, the economic and processes by which we are able to build and equip the systems and weapons that defend us and defend our allies, is in serious crisis. It's widely recognized now. When I first published Freedom's Forge, there was sense that, yeah, there's something rotten in that state, but now I think it's really understood that we have some serious problems. A lot of these were exposed by the war in Ukraine. when it became clear that by sending large amounts of, or not even large amounts, just moderate amounts of armaments to Ukraine to support their war against Russia, that we were depleting stockpiles of weapons which we weren't in a position to replace. That this was going to be this enormous shortage of certain kinds of very basic materials. For example, 155 millimeter artillery shells. This is not advanced technology. I mean, this is a technology that goes back to World War II, goes back to World War I as a staple of use in the battlefield here, of handheld anti-tank missiles, that these things were not only had we given up the inventory, but we had no one who was going to be able to replace them, that a whole new sort of line of factories had to be reopened in order to replace these things. And so it exposed the fact that we had these increasing shortages with regard to conventional weapons on the one hand, which are, after all, the instruments of and the products of industrial production, right? Of an economy that's geared towards industrial production, and that in our competition with China, which was the other key theme in the discussion we had at Endless Frontiers, that we also have a sense of falling behind in certain key advanced technologies. Adam mentioned AI. It's one in which a technology the United States developed, pioneered actually, going back to the 1960s, and now very much the sense that China has really sort of taken the lead in its strategic use as a way to enhance national power and build national power. Development of hypersonic missiles, of a range of things, in which we have a sense that there is this tremendous innovation, experimentation, productivity that's taking place in the private sector, in the commercial sector, but which really hasn't sort of taken hold of in a systematic way, in the way in which we arm and defend ourselves. The major seat of that concern and occupation being the Department of Defense, the Pentagon. And what I think one of the things that came out of that conference, and this comes back to our themes about dynamism, was a point raised by one of the major participants yesterday, when he said the problem that we face in the Pentagon today isn't innovation or a lack of innovation. In fact, the Pentagon is obsessed with innovation. They're constantly looking for ways in which they can summon up all the best entrepreneurial drives and products and processes emerging out of Silicon Valley and elsewhere, and use those to build and to create and to support decisive weapons of the future. They have opened the doors to small companies and startups to try and find a way to bring their technologies into the nation's arsenal. There is this proliferation of innovation offices in all of the services in the Pentagon today. I spent these last 2 years working with a congressional commission working on Pentagon budget reform. Talk about Sisyphean tasks on Pentagon budget reform. And one of the things that I learned was just how many of these innovation or rapid fielding offices to get technologies as quickly as possible out to the battlefield to use for the warfighters, how many of these offices, there's close to 200 of these separate offices, right? Each of them with a budget of maybe about $10 to $15 million. Who are out there to encourage all of you eager young entrepreneurs and startup companies to come in and show your wares and show what's going to happen here. Nothing of significance is really happening. There's a lot of noise, a lot of activity going on, but not a lot of progress with this. And what this participant said was that the Pentagon's problem is not too little innovation. It's too much process. And that's what it really comes down. And that's not going to come as a surprise to you if you know anything about how the Pentagon bureaucracy works and can pretty much guess as to how that works. And that is that it is one layer after another of bureaucratic, risk-averse regulation and controls have been put into place that make it very, very difficult for the culture of the Pentagon to connect with the kind of entrepreneurial, mission-driven world that is the world of today's founders, builders, entrepreneurs in any kind of way. There is a disconnect between the two that has taken place here. And I always have to remind people, one of the most important rubrics to always bear in mind here is that in the world of the entrepreneur, the world of of company founders, the world in which drives capitalism is about making things happen. Making a product, making a service, making goods, and that the role of government is best at making sure things don't happen. You know, sometimes that's a very good thing because you don't want disasters to take place. You don't want to find yourself in a situation in which risk taking has sort of gone off on a runaway journey. Here, government has a role to prevent those kinds of things. But what it also means, and this is, I think, part of Adam's point as well as Virginia's, is that risk-averse culture begins to take on a life of its own. And this is precisely, I think, what the issue that the Endless Frontiers participants, the 200 plus who were there, have been concerned about and worried about. And where they look back to where there wasn't that disconnect, and in particular as an historical phenomenon, was the example of World War II. And that's why my book has taken on this kind of life of its own in a discussion. My book, Freedom's Forge, How American Business Produced Victory in World War II, because what I do in the book is really talk about how that amazing wartime production miracle that took place in American factories and shipyards and plants and facilities here, that this amazing outburst here that took place because President Roosevelt, in the summer of 1940, they were talking about a year and a half before Pearl Harbor, the summer of 1940, realized America was very likely going to be drawn into a major war. If not in Europe, they would come to the America's shores if Britain fell to the Nazis. And that realizing that America was not at all prepared for such a modern mechanized conflict of the kind that was unfolding in Europe today, that we were hopelessly behind. It seemed hopelessly behind in terms of our technologies, in terms of our resources, in terms of our commitment that would be involved in such a conflict, that the only choice he had was to bring in America's leading commercial companies and to reach out, starting with the automobile company, and saying to the man who really represented the legend of the automobile industry in 1940, a Danish immigrant by the name of Bill Knudsen, and saying to him, who was then CEO of General Motors, and saying to him, how would you do this? How would you be able to get America's industrial capacity, which is unsurpassed throughout the world, the greatest industrial plant in the world? How do we get this to move from making civilian goods to making military goods? And Bill Knudsen said, as I explained in the book, he said, I'll tell you what, you give me 18 months and my colleagues and I will get together and we will have more military gear pouring out of our factories and plants than you'll know what to do with. And Roosevelt resisted the temptation to try and exercise control from the White House over the overall process, turned the process of rearming America to its commercial companies, to the automobile industry, the electronics industry, and gave them the room in which to figure out not only how to make things, but also what to make and how to make it in vast numbers, in scalable numbers, as we like to say now, as economists like to talk about it. And the numbers are just, staggering what took place. You know, the output that came with that process, 350,000 airplanes, with an Air Force that was still basically one generation away from the biplane era before Knudsen and his colleagues got started here. We're talking about over 288 submarines. We're talking about 2.5 million machine guns, 2.5 million trucks, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. in which to arm all of this equipment here. And the demonstration of what it was like when you unleashed the dynamism, I'm going to use that word now, of American industrial production on a problem such as military production. One great example, one excellent example of that was when Bill Knudsen turned to the company that he had worked with at GM for years called Saginaw Steering Gear. Well, you know what they made. And he turned to Saginaw and said, "Can you make 30 caliber machine guns?" They said, "Well, we don't know. We've never made a machine gun in our lives. What does it look like?" So he gave them a couple of examples, and they looked at it and turned it around, and they said, "Yeah, we can probably figure out how to make these things." So they signed a contract. They signed a contract starting in October of 1940 to deliver by the spring of 1942 to deliver 2,600 30 caliber machine guns based on the Browning design. And sure enough, March of 1942, Saginaw Steering Gear delivered not 2,600 machine guns, but 26,000. Right? That's unleashing the dynamism. That's unleashing the productivity of American. And this is one that spread across the American industrial landscape in the course of the war. By 1944, American shipyards were producing 8 aircraft carriers a month at that point, and a warplane every 5 minutes. That's the productivity that was, the dynamism was unleashed with it. So the big discussion is, having read my book and seen these incredible numbers and the incredible work and people who were doing all this, well, how do we do this again? How can we bring this about now? What are the ways in which we can reconnect, in a sense, the productive power of the American economy, American entrepreneurs, to meet our government's needs, particularly in the national security area, especially there, where it is so critical and so urgent in this way. And it's the search for, and I've because of this conference, I've wound up coining a term about my own book title, and it's the search for the freedom's forged effects, is what it is. That how do we reproduce it? How do we get to such an achievement again? Well, that's the big issue, the problem that we face. And obviously the role of government and bureaucracy of limiting the power of innovation and development here is an important part of that, of correcting and dealing with those solutions. And that's what we talked about for the last 2 years. And I'm not going to tell you what they were, because you don't need to know that. What I want to talk about in the time that I've got left here before reception calls is I want to talk about that fact that industrial machine, right, that enormous industrial productivity and dynamism that Roosevelt was able to tap into in the summer of 1940 and then all through World War II, didn't just exist in a vacuum, right? It was itself the product of a long cultural evolution as well as economic evolution that had reached its kind of pinnacle. Even after the Great Depression, even the Great Depression couldn't make a serious dent in that kind of dynamism of economic and industrial production and went with it. That something was deeper. There was a deeper level of commitment to the key virtues, the driving energies that make it possible to enjoy and to recognize and to bring about that kind of dynamism and that kind of productivity. And that's what the second book that I want to talk about here, How the Scots Invented the Modern World, is really all about. And what that book is about is it's about Scots, but it's also about a particular group of Scots, a group of Scottish thinkers and philosophers, and what we'd call today social scientists. Although they invented social science, they didn't practice it, they invented it. Who in the 18th century in Glasgow, in Edinburgh, and in Aberdeen, in the universities there, created an understanding of what it is, what are the key dynamic principles that drive and that can sustain modernity and grow at the same time economic power and economic dynamism in that regard here. And it's with these, and the name that stands out from this group is always Adam Smith, but he's not alone. It's the story of the understanding the cultural roots of this kind of dynamism belongs to Adam Smith and his friends. And that's really the core of the book in reading it, is Adam Smith and his friends, men like David Hume and William Robertson, Francis Hutcheson, a little bit later, Dougal Stewart, and the way in which they came to understand the dynamics of modern society and boiled it down to a set of driving principles that really underlay what was happening. And it's important to realize that these Scottish thinkers, including Adam Smith, we think about their work like Wealth of Nations as kind of programmatic work, right? Here's how you do it. Here's how you create the wealth of nations, right? By following these kinds of principles. That these were not, in a sense, a set of thought exercises. And the thing that's one of the things I stress in that book is that they were watching this happen in their own Scotland as a result of its union with England to create the Kingdom of Great Britain. That union had brought a surge of economic opportunity that also released a surge of energy and drive on the part of Scots in these leading cities that transformed the cities into major commercial centers. But then that wasn't enough. Then the Scots had to go out and bring the same transformation south to England and then to the rest of the empire in the same way here. So what are those key principles, key elements? Really quickly, we'll summarize them for you, and you can take them home and practice them in your privacy of your own living room. A couple of obvious ones, objective ones that we would immediately recognize. One is that Scotland in the 18th century, although it was desperately poor at the beginning of the century, desperately poor, had the advantage of almost universal literacy. And that was literacy for both males and females. That was part of the Calvinist tradition. Everybody needs to be able to read the Bible. Everybody needs to be able to have access to the Word of God. But this gave Scotland a built-in advantage from the beginning in terms of its ability to use and process information that would be helpful for economic progress, for political progress, for a whole range of other ways in which to interact in the world, the access that comes through literacy. That is number one, I think, advantage that comes with it. The second one is the fact that there was an incredibly mobile society. Scots didn't hesitate to move anywhere, whether it was from the countryside to the city, from the highlands to the cities, move south to England, move south across the empire. And the reason was because everybody knew that the last place you wanted to end up was in Scotland. And if you've visited Scotland and been up in the Highlands, it's very, very beautiful, but it would not necessarily be the place in which you would want to spend the rest of your life, eking out a living as a farmer or as a cattle herder or all the other limited opportunities that Scots had in the 18th century, unless they went to the places where dynamism was underway and taking place, the cities. But the environments, the economic environments that were coming forward there. So there's, I think, you can say two objective principles. But what were the ones that the Scots themselves, Smith and his friends, sort of isolated as being key to all this? One was, and I'll list three. One was free markets. That one of the key aspects to dynamism was to create an environment in which human beings were able to interact and engage with each other in terms of economic transactions with as few impediments as possible, right? Free market capitalism. That's what Wealth of Nations is about that. Because by doing so, by creating free market capitalism, by creating the situations in which Adam's permissionless innovation can take place across broad sectors of society, you create one in which people can buy and sell according to the price that they set, as opposed to how government decides where the just price would be or which goods are to be prioritized over other. Free market capitalism. Free markets is a key to releasing that energy and that drive. Because for the Scots, what the free market does is that it brings out, it's an outlet for our natural liberty. That human beings are naturally, inherently want to be free and to make up their own minds and make their own decisions about their lives. And a free market environment, an ecosystem, as we would say today, allows them to do that with the most beneficial results for all. Because in the process, they learn through division of labor how to make the things that bring them the most self-interest, but at the same time allow them to trade in exchange with others for the things that they make from their self-interest to everybody's benefit. Now, it's important to understand that for Adam Smith, and I stress this in the book, it was not the case that free market capitalism requires that everyone become capitalists, right? It doesn't require that every time you go into Starbucks that you look around, you drink your coffee and say, damn it, I think I want to create my own. I want to get my own Starbucks here and get it, and I can do it a lot better than Starbucks does it. Not everyone's going to do that. People are going to be content to enjoy the opulence that a free market capitalist system creates. But enough people will become, even though they may be a small elite, enough people, there'll be enough Elon Musks or Andrew Carnegies or G. Rockefellers who will become so obsessed with pursuing profit, with pursuing their self-interest and maximizing that through the free market system, that they will produce an abundance and an opulence that will be enough to support everyone who isn't part of that system. A free market capitalist system does not require everybody has to be sign on to all the values that make it. Just enough that everybody else can derive their livelihoods and derive the pleasures that flow from that. Now, natural liberty itself depends upon the second tenet that I'll mention, which is that the pervasiveness that all the Scottish thinkers understood of the principles of natural law. That, in other words, that one of the reasons why natural liberty is able to expand and maximize our happiness and our enjoyment and our self-enrichment is because it operates in a framework of natural law, of natural laws which are a rational order put in place, endowed by a creator, in which there are basic rules embedded in nature that control and direct not only the workings of nature, but also the workings of human nature in the same way. Now, the one philosopher who kind of disagrees with that is David Hume, Hume comes back and says, natural law, I'd love to see some evidence for that and how that kind of works, because you look around the world, not everybody seems to adhere to this. But even David Hume had to admit that if people believe there is a natural law, that there is something embedded in the world that governs good and evil, that governs what is the best outcomes if we follow the dictates of nature, that even if it doesn't exist, if we act on those, actually we get some really good results. So in the end, David Hume, although he's skeptical about natural law as such, he does recognize that there is something out there in terms of human beings' interactions in society that does tend to move towards the same end. Natural law, which we perceive through the third tenet, which is our common sense. This becomes a fundamental part of, particularly of the sort of later parts of the Scottish Enlightenment, of the idea that we have, as human beings, all of us, have an innate understanding of what is right and what is wrong, of what is up, what is down, of what works to our benefit and what does not, and that we have this innate sense, which is common to all of us, an innate sense that gives us and allows us to understand the workings of natural law and the ways in which nature provides a means by which we'll be able to open up and develop those kinds of changes, including through science and technology. And that's another important point I want to stress here, that the Scots, the assumption was that when we engage in a development of new technologies, when we probe through science to understand the hidden structure of things, that what we are doing is not flying in the face of nature, right? Like James Watt's steam engine, right? It's an invention. It's a new way of manipulating, controlling natural forces, but it's not fly in the face of nature. It's not a contradiction of nature. It's the workings of natural law. That every time we advance a technology, what we're really doing is exploring the next level of the laws of nature as they exist here. It's a very different view about science and technology from that of the German Romantics, for example. for whom nature is this pristine, unspoiled environment in which human beings are happiest when they leave it in its pristine natural state. We connect with it here. And that the world of the factory, the world of the cyclotron, the world of AI are basically kind of violations of that natural order. Scots take a very different view. No, technology is an extension of natural law, of the way things work, not a violation of it or a replacement for it. But common sense, and I mention common sense here too, because it is of all three, I think, come to become embedded in the American experience in the 18th and the 19th century. All the founding fathers, natural law is fundamental to their understanding of the way in which natural liberty in the American Republic will be formed. But it's also important, we forget how important the common sense philosophy was as a part of American education and of American culture in the 19th century. All the major advances in American education in the 19th century, particularly in the school system, rested on the common sense philosophy inherited from the Scots. And if you look at the two major philosophers of the American philosophers at the end of the 19th century, Charles Sanders Peirce and then also William James, both of their thinking and understanding of the world are extensions of that Scottish common sense realism here. So these are the kinds of ideas. If we have a frame of mind, a mindset, which is geared around the fact that we are happiest when we are freest, right? But we are safe to be free. we are safe free because we operate in a framework of natural law, of a natural order of things, and a creator who has put that in place here, and that we have and are come equipped as human beings naturally, innately, with an ability to understand those laws of nature and to place ourselves in that environment, in that perspective, in this kind of way. That you are going to inevitably develop the kind of optimism about not just science and technology, but also about the overall forces of progress that take place and that are underway in your society in a way that is so characteristic of the American experience from the 19th century into the 20th century, and that really underlay that enormous outburst of economic production and industrial production that President Roosevelt in 1940 was able to then harness and devote to an entirely new level of arming for war and preparing for dealing with opponents of a kind the United States had never really faced before here. The dynamism, the rules, simple rules in a complex world. That isn't a great description of natural law, I don't know what is. That these are in themselves also embodiments of a certain mindset. Now, today, I think certain aspects of that mindset may not stand up to our own natural skepticism and scrutiny. It certainly didn't for David Hume. The conflict between Thomas Reid as the father of common sense realism in Scotland and David Hume was a fierce one, and one in which the debate about really David Hume was saying innate. We have an innate sense of what is right and wrong as opposed to learned habits. But the point is that recovering where we're going to go as an American dynamism and reviving and rebuilding whether it's not just defense industrial base, but our own economic fortunes in this way, I think it bears some scrutiny to go back to where those cultural roots lie as part of the history of the American experience, and to give them a similar kind of appreciation, analysis, evaluation, in the same way that we do in thinking about the technological or legal or social processes that underlie how we talk about dynamism. And there I'm going to stop. Hang on to it.
I think it's a fascinating argument that you make, connecting these two seemingly completely unconnected events in a logical and I think persuasive way. But I'd like to just for make a devil's advocate kind of argument, which is what academics do. You're right about the capability of the United States. I haven't read your book, actually. I must admit, but I just looked at it. To harness its massive civilian mass production system to the purposes of war. And as you said, this started quite a while before the war, which was our great luck. And clearly, as Richard Overy argues in his book, Why the Allies Won, it was this huge deployment of mass production that eventually helped overwhelm the Germans. But there is an alternative to the free market, unleashing its industrial force. And of course, that is what happened in the Soviet Union, where nobody would confuse the Soviet Union with a system of free markets or free anything. But the fact of the matter is that they were able to do in their own way something quite similar what the Americans did, which is produce huge amounts of hardware that eventually helped sweep the Germans out of their country. And so you're right that it happened this way. My only comment is it didn't have to be this way. Other systems might have worked as well.
It's a wonderful argument, and I'm glad you bring it into this discussion, because in terms of understanding the two great models for industrialization in the 20th century, right? The two that were set side by side all through the 1920s and then even through the Cold War, where you have the Soviet model, which is top down. You have the American model, which is to some degree or another a bottoms up free market. The other one, top down, dirigiste approach to industrial production. And yet, when we come to the example of the World War II, we have to take a slightly different look at what the dynamics were in that particular case. And I mean that in the sense that almost every aspect of the Soviet industrial miracle of the 1920s, and particularly the 1930s, was all organized and put into place by American engineers and American engineering companies who came over, particularly during the Depression when there was not much opportunity for business opportunity in the United States, but who went to the Soviet Union and sort of said, what can we do for you? What can we help? They helped to, for example, completely reorganize the Soviet railroad system, which was in a state of total chaos after the revolution, and made it into a reasonably efficient transportation system. They completely redid the hydroelectric and energy grid. It was American companies, American engineers who did all of this, who brought that, and then also of the development of the iron and steel industry in the Soviet Union was all due to the work that was done by American engineering companies who came over. And my favorite example of the one, I know it's the one you will think of too right away, is the example of the great tractor factory at Stalingrad. Right, the scene of the terrible fighting and bloodbath and war of attrition between Germans and Soviet troops, swirling around and through the tractor factory, which became a kind of symbol of Stalin's industrial persistence, right, and be able to turn out turning from tractors to tanks, and in order to build that. When the truth of the matter is that when the tractor factory in Stalingrad was built in the mid-30s, it was all built by American workers. That in 1935, there were 10,000 American workers resident in Stalingrad, working and putting that plant together. And from the beginning, at Stalin's order, it was put into place so that it would be possible, if necessary, to shift from producing factories to producing tanks. The tanks being the classic example. What do we think of as the iconic Soviet tank of World War II, the T-34? Who was the designer of the T-34? Christie, right? Ian Christie, who the regime had been rejected by the War Department, and so he gathered up his drawings and went over to the Soviet Union, and they bought into it and became and laid the ancestor for the T-34. Now, those American engineers, those American engineering companies who came over, and I did a fair amount of work on this. In fact, I was going to do a book on the whole subject. about how Americans built the Soviet Union. What was interesting about it was that all of these engineers and companies who came over, I mean, it's this weird story. These guys who come from Cleveland, right? Cleveland engineering companies who end up getting the Order of Lenin and stuff like that for their work. What's interesting about it, of course, all of their habits, all of their work ethic, all of their skills, their skill set that they bring with, have all developed within an American capitalist system here. Now, granted, Stalin's ability to harness a highly coercive bureaucratic state in order to make that and squeeze out every last bit of productivity out of those facilities, and to make that possible. Yeah, grant authoritarian governments can be really good at that. Even fly in the face of complete economic collapse, they can still make airplanes, they could still make tanks in the process. And yet the system within which Stalin was working, the system that was resilient enough to respond to that kind of squeeze in wartime emergency, it's all Americans. It's all built by Americans trained in the free market capitalist system. It's ironic.
Thanks for being here. It's been great. How do you respond to the growing consensus, both sides of the aisle, that the very open markets that Adam Smith celebrated have led to the outsourcing of manufacturing capacity that would allow for a Freedom's Forge situation to occur in the United States again? Do you think that open markets are responsible for the lack of, say, shipbuilding capacity in the U.S. today? And second, do you think that more state control through various means is required to regain that capacity?
To reverse the process that goes with it. Well, that was one of the things we were talking about at great length at the Endless Frontiers Conference. And I think that when you think about the deindustrialization of the United States, which is to a certain degree over-exaggerated, right? We still have a very impressive manufacturing capacity that's underway, but it's much more diffuse than it was in Roosevelt and Bill Knudsen's time when he was asked to undertake this role here too. And it's much more dependent on a supply chain that has gone global in the same way. Yeah, I mean, I think that the chase of the quote free market that led to companies to decide, it's a lot cheaper if we rely on the really inexpensive labor that we can find in other countries as a means by which to produce the goods or components for goods that we're making here at home. That was definitely a trend that went with it, right, under the circumstances. And yet, at the same time, what we're realizing, and I think this may be part of what underlies the whole Trump tariff démarche that's underway and we've faced here, is a realization that this was not, in fact, the operation of free market principles at all, that, in fact, countries were creating conditions under which to undercut, through political means, and which to undercut American productivity. And the role of tariffs by other countries of playing a powerful way in which to compel U.S. to say, it's just a lot cheaper for us to outsource than produce home. And one of the reasons is because every time we try and sell goods over there, we're hit with these, not just tariffs, but a whole range of obstacles to our ability to sell goods abroad. Whereas the restrictions that are faced to bring them here are nugatory. And therefore, they don't really add to our cost. They don't add to our bottom line here. So I think an argument could be made, Virginia, that in fact that Donald Trump is the champion of free markets, and that the campaign with regard to tariffs that he's engaged in is a way to loosen up.
Explain the tariffs on Israel.
As a way to bring about that kind of change and to level the playing field in that point. A good argument can be made in that regard here. I don't think I'm going to, and I think that to understand the way in which the imbalance in the American economy is due to too much free market and I think is therefore a grave mistake.
Well, it only took us 3 hours to get to tariffs, and we've ended with a disagreement, so we should probably hit the bar. I'd like to invite you to join me. Yeah.